In the early 1870s, Brighton was one of England's most fashionable seaside towns, a place of promenades, bathing machines, and sweet shops doing brisk trade with holidaymakers. Christiana Edmunds lived there with her widowed mother, a well-bred, unmarried woman in her early 40s, privately educated, and by all outward appearances, entirely respectable. Beneath that respectability, she had already been diagnosed with hysteria in her 20s, and she had grown obsessively attached to a local physician, a man who was already married. That physician was Dr. Charles Beard. Edmunds had become close to him in the late 1860s, sending him letters and engaging in what he would later describe, carefully, as only mild flirtation. Whatever the true nature of their relationship, Edmunds wanted more than Beard was willing or able to give, and she made little secret of her attachment among people who knew the family. Standing between them was his wife. In September 1870, Edmunds gave Mrs. Beard a chocolate cream candy, an ordinary seaside treat that gave no outward sign anything was wrong. Within hours, Mrs. Beard was violently ill, gripped by convulsions consistent with poisoning. Mrs. Beard survived. Dr. Beard, privately, suspected Edmunds immediately. He had no proof, and he feared the scandal that an accusation against a respectable woman would bring on his household. So he said nothing, and Christiana Edmunds walked away from an attempted murder with no consequences at all. It was the kind of silence that, in retrospect, gave a disturbed woman the confidence to escalate rather than stop. Edmunds' next scheme was more calculated and far more indiscriminate. She began purchasing chocolate creams from a well-known local confectioner, John Maynard, whose shop on Brighton's West Street served the whole town. She would buy a box, carry it home, and quietly work strychnine into the soft centers of the candies with a needle. Then she returned the doctored chocolates to Maynard's shop, exchanging them or slipping them back among his stock so that unsuspecting customers, not Edmunds herself, would buy them off the shelf. To get the poison, Edmunds first went to a local chemist named Isaac Garrett, telling him she needed strychnine to deal with a problem of stray cats. When that source grew risky to keep using, she began paying local boys small sums to buy strychnine for her at different shops, spreading the purchases out so no single chemist would grow suspicious of one woman buying poison again and again. It was a methodical, patient scheme, built entirely around a small seaside candy counter that had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The poisoned chocolates began reaching ordinary customers, and Brighton started seeing a strange cluster of sudden, violent illnesses after visits to the sweet shop. Most recovered. Then, in June 1871, 4-year-old Sidney Albert Barker ate chocolates bought from Maynard's shop and died. It was the only death Edmunds' poisoning campaign would ultimately be tied to, but at the time, no one connected a small child's death to a respectable local woman's private grievance against a married doctor. The Brighton coroner, David Black, examined the case and returned a verdict of accidental death. There was no obvious motive tying a random child's candy to anyone in particular, and adulterated or contaminated sweets were not an unheard-of hazard of the era. The investigation into Sidney Barker's death effectively closed. Christiana Edmunds, whose scheme had now killed a child, faced no scrutiny at all, and the poisonings in Brighton might have simply been written off as a tragic mystery.
Instead, Edmunds escalated again, and in so doing, began building her own undoing. As whispers connected the illnesses to Maynard's chocolates, she started mailing poisoned parcels to strangers and prominent Brighton residents, apparently trying to widen the pattern of victims so that suspicion would land on Maynard's shop itself rather than on any one customer. She even sent poisoned chocolates to Mrs. Beard again, and sent parcels to herself so she could present herself publicly as yet another victim of a mysterious poisoner loose in Brighton. It was a plan built on the assumption that no one would look past the candy to the person distributing it. But Dr. Charles Beard had never stopped watching Christiana Edmunds. As the parcels multiplied and his own wife was poisoned a second time, his private suspicion from the year before hardened into certainty, and he finally went to the police with what he knew and had long withheld. The case that had been ruled a tragic accident reopened as a criminal investigation. Christiana Edmunds was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of Mrs. Beard and the murder of Sidney Barker. Committal hearings were held near Brighton before the case, given its scale and notoriety, was moved to London's Old Bailey. Her trial opened in January 1872, drawing intense public fascination with a case that combined poison, adultery, and a respectable woman's secret obsession, and newspapers across the country followed every session in detail. At trial, Edmunds' own mother testified that mental illness ran on both sides of the family, laying the groundwork for an insanity defense. Dr. Beard testified that he and Edmunds had never had a physical affair, only letters and flirtation, distancing himself from the woman whose fixation on him had, by any honest accounting, driven the entire scheme. The jury found her guilty of murder and she was sentenced to death. But given the evidence of her mental state, that sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Christiana Edmunds spent the rest of her life at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, dying there in 1907, 35 years after her trial. The press had already given her the name history remembers her by, the Chocolate Cream Killer. Her case remains one of Victorian Britain's starkest warnings about how easily a poison hidden in something as ordinary as a sweet shop candy can outrun any single victim, spreading harm through a whole town before anyone thinks to ask where the danger is actually coming from.